The financial stability of U.S. states is shaped by taxation policies, federal funding, and economic structures. Red states, typically Republican-led, often advocate for low taxes and limited government spending. However, this can create financial difficulties, especially during economic downturns or budget crises. But what happens when these states run out of money? Let's break it down in detail. Why do some red states struggle financially? Red states generally prioritize low taxes, minimal regulation, and business-friendly policies. While these strategies can encourage economic growth and attract businesses, they also reduce state revenue, making it difficult to fund essential services such as education, healthcare, and infrastructure. A significant number of red states heavily rely on federal aid to supplement their budgets. States like Mississippi, West Virginia, and Kentucky receive far more federal funds than they contribute in taxes. This creates what some economists call the red state paradox. Many states that champion small government actually depend on federal dollars to survive. For instance, Mississippi gets 42% of its budget from federal funding, while West Virginia and Alabama receive around 39% and 37% respectively. Without this aid, these states would face major budget shortfalls, potentially leading to severe economic instability. Another challenge is that many red states have economies that are highly dependent on specific industries, such as coal, oil, or agriculture. When these industries decline due to market shifts or government policies, states can experience massive revenue losses. West Virginia, for example, has suffered from the decline of the coal industry, which once provided substantial tax revenue and jobs. The combination of low tax policies, industry-dependent economies, and heavy reliance on federal aid makes red states financially vulnerable. If federal funding is cut or an economic downturn occurs, these states could quickly run out of money, leading to severe consequences for public services and residents. The role of federal funding: who pays for what? A crucial reason many red states avoid financial collapse is federal funding, which fills the gaps left by low state tax revenues. The federal government provides funds for various programs, including Medicaid and Medicare education grants and public school funding, infrastructure development, disaster relief, and emergency assistance. Agricultural and business subsidies. In many cases, red states receive more federal funds than they contribute in federal taxes. This is particularly evident in states with large rural populations and weaker tax bases. For example, Kentucky receives $2.41 in federal funding for every dollar it contributes in federal taxes. Similarly, Mississippi receives $2.53 per dollar paid. This reliance on federal aid has led to political debates about whether these states are truly self-sufficient or dependent on the very government spending their leaders often criticize. However, this heavy dependence on federal funds creates a major risk. If a political shift in Washington leads to reduced federal aid, red states could struggle to maintain essential services. Budget shortfalls could force states to either cut spending or raise taxes, both of which could have significant political and economic consequences. Additionally, certain red states rely on federal emergency relief funds for disasters such as hurricanes, tornadoes, or flooding. States like Florida and Texas frequently receive billions in aid for disaster recovery. If federal support declines, these states may face serious financial crises, making it difficult to rebuild infrastructure and assist affected communities. Without consistent federal support, many red states would quickly run out of money, making it difficult to fund government programs, pay public employees, and maintain critical services. The collapse of essential services. What gets cut first? When red states experience budget shortfalls, one of the first responses is cutting public services. Since these states often have low tax rates, they have fewer revenue sources to rely on during financial crises. As a result, they are forced to make difficult decisions about where to reduce spending. Some of the most common budget cuts include education, school funding reductions, teacher layoffs, and fewer resources for students. Healthcare, funding for hospitals, leading to closures in rural areas. Infrastructure, delayed road repairs, crumbling bridges, and outdated public transit. Public safety, reduced police, firefighter, and emergency responder budgets. For example, Kansas faced a major budget crisis in the early 2010s after Governor Sam Brownback implemented aggressive tax cuts, hoping to stimulate economic growth. Instead, the state saw a massive revenue shortfall, forcing major cuts to public schools and government services. The financial disaster became so severe that Kansas lawmakers eventually reversed the tax cuts to stabilize the economy. Another example is Mississippi, where over 40 rural hospitals are at risk of closing due to a lack of state funding. Without federal support, many red states could experience widespread healthcare access issues, particularly in rural areas where hospitals are already struggling to stay open. Budget cuts can have long-term consequences, reducing the quality of life for residents and making states less attractive for businesses and workers. If states continue to underfund essential services, they may experience population decline and economic stagnation, making financial recovery even harder. The pension crisis. Can states keep paying retirees? One of the most overlooked financial challenges in red states is the pension crisis. Many states have large numbers of retired public employees, including teachers, police officers, and government workers, who rely on state-funded pensions. When a state faces financial difficulties, it struggles to pay these pensions, putting retirees at risk. States like Kentucky, Illinois, and Louisiana have some of the worst-funded pension systems in the country. Kentucky's pension system, for example, has an unfunded liability of over $40 billion, meaning the state does not have enough money to pay for promised retirement benefits. As pension funds run low, states are forced to make tough decisions. Cut benefits for retirees, which could lead to economic hardship for elderly citizens. Increase taxes to raise money for pensions, which goes against traditional conservative policies. Borrow money to cover pension costs, which creates long-term debt problems. Some states try to avoid the crisis by raising the retirement age or reducing pension payouts, but this often leads to public backlash. If pensions continue to go underfunded, states may eventually ask for federal bailouts, putting additional strain on national resources. The pension crisis highlights a major issue in red states. Low taxes can limit a state's ability to meet long-term financial obligations. If pension funds collapse, states could face severe economic instability, leading to widespread financial consequences. The education crisis, when schools run out of money. One of the biggest consequences of financial instability in red states is the crisis in public education. Many Republican-led states emphasize low taxes and limited government spending, which often translates into underfunded public schools. When a red state runs out of money, education funding is one of the first areas to suffer, with serious consequences for students, teachers, and the future workforce. A key example is Oklahoma, where severe budget cuts in education have led to overcrowded classrooms, outdated textbooks, and teacher shortages. In 2018, Oklahoma teachers went on strike due to poor pay and underfunded schools, forcing the government to increase spending. But many states still struggle with low teacher salaries and school funding gaps, making it difficult to retain qualified educators. Another state facing an education funding crisis is Mississippi. Ranked last in the nation for education in many studies, Mississippi struggles with low test scores, high dropout rates, and outdated school facilities. A major reason for this is the state's reluctance to raise taxes to fund education properly. Many red states also reject federal education grants that come with government regulations. For instance, some states refuse federal funding for programs like universal pre-K or special education, leaving schools without crucial resources. Additionally, some states promote private school vouchers and charter schools, diverting money away from traditional public schools. When schools are underfunded, students suffer from fewer academic resources, outdated technology, and reduced extracurricular activities. Over time, this weakens the state's workforce competitiveness, making it harder to attract new businesses and investments. The education crisis highlights a major long-term risk for red states. Failing to invest in schools can lead to economic stagnation, as poorly educated workers struggle to compete in an increasingly technology-driven economy. If states continue to cut education funding, they may see higher poverty rates, lower wages, and a weaker job market, ultimately deepening their financial troubles. The healthcare crisis, hospitals on the brink of collapsed healthcare, is another area that suffers when a red state runs out of money. Many Republican-led states have rejected Medicaid expansion, a program under the Affordable Care Act that provides additional federal funding to help cover healthcare costs for low-income residents. This decision has left millions of people without access to affordable healthcare, while hospitals in these states face serious financial struggles. One of the biggest problems is rural hospital closures. In states like Texas, Georgia, and Mississippi, Dozens of rural hospitals have shut down due to financial problems. Without Medicaid expansion, hospitals lose millions in funding, forcing them to close or reduce services. This creates healthcare deserts where residents must travel hours for medical care, increasing preventable deaths from treatable conditions. For example, Texas leads the nation in rural hospital closures, with at least 26 hospitals shutting down since 2010. The state's decision to reject Medicaid expansion has left over 1 million residents without access to affordable health care, putting enormous strain on emergency rooms and community clinics. Another major issue is the shortage of doctors and nurses. Low healthcare funding leads to understaffed hospitals, longer wait times, and reduced medical services. Many healthcare professionals leave for states with better pay and working conditions, making the crisis even worse. Public health programs also suffer when states face budget crises. Programs like mental health services, substance abuse treatment, and maternal health care often get cut, leaving vulnerable populations without critical support. In some states, infant mortality rates and opioid addiction rates have increased due to a lack of funding for healthcare initiatives. If red states continue to underfund healthcare, they risk higher mortality rates, a weaker workforce, and economic instability. A sick and unhealthy population reduces productivity and increases state costs in the long run, making financial recovery even more difficult. The infrastructure breakdown. When roads and bridges crumble. Another major issue when red states run out of money is failing infrastructure. Many of these states already struggle with aging roads, outdated bridges, and underfunded public transportation systems. When states experience financial difficulties, infrastructure projects are often delayed or canceled, leading to dangerous conditions for residents. For example, Missouri has over 3,000 structurally deficient bridges, but due to budget constraints, the state can only repair a small fraction each year. Similarly, Mississippi has over 500 closed bridges that local governments can't afford to fix, forcing drivers to take longer, more dangerous routes. Public transit systems in red states also suffer from a lack of investment. Unlike blue states, which tend to fund robust public transportation networks, many red states prioritize road construction over buses and trains. This makes it difficult for low-income workers to commute, reducing job opportunities and hurting local economies. Another major problem is water infrastructure. In states like Texas, Florida, and Louisiana, climate change and extreme weather events have put enormous pressure on water systems, levees, and power grids. For example, the Texas power grid failure in 2021 left millions without electricity during a winter storm, causing hundreds of deaths and billions in damages. Yet, due to budget constraints and political opposition to regulation, little has been done to prevent future crises. Failing infrastructure hurts businesses, tourism, and overall economic growth. If roads, bridges, and water systems continue to deteriorate, states will struggle to attract new investments, leading to further financial instability. Without long-term infrastructure funding, red states risk falling behind in economic development, making recovery even harder. The tax dilemma. Raise taxes or cut more services? When a red state runs out of money, lawmakers face a tough choice: raise taxes or cut services even further. Since most Republican-led states strongly oppose tax increases, they often choose to slash government programs, which can create a downward spiral of economic problems. For example, Kansas experimented with extreme tax cuts in the early 2010s, hoping to boost business investment. Instead, the state faced a massive revenue shortfall, forcing deep cuts to schools, healthcare, and infrastructure. The situation became so dire that Kansas had to reverse the tax cuts to stabilize the economy. Other states, like Louisiana and Oklahoma, have faced similar crises. Both states implemented major tax cuts, only to experience budget deficits and service reductions. In some cases, states have raised sales taxes to compensate for lost revenue, which disproportionately impacts low-income residents. The problem is that without adequate revenue, states can't invest in education, healthcare, infrastructure, or public safety. This leads to population decline, slower job growth, and economic stagnation. Businesses and young workers leave for states with better opportunities, further reducing the tax base. Ultimately, red states must decide whether to adjust their tax policies or risk economic collapse. While raising taxes is politically unpopular, failing to do so leads to deeper budget crises, putting essential services at risk. The future of red state economies? Can they recover? Looking ahead, red states facing financial difficulties must find ways to stabilize their economies. This may involve diversifying industries, investing in education, expanding healthcare, and modernizing infrastructure. However, political resistance to government spending often makes it difficult to implement long-term solutions. Some states, like Texas and Florida, have strong economies due to population growth and business investments. However, other red states continue to struggle with poverty, low wages, and underfunded public services. If red states continue to rely on federal aid while cutting local investments, they risk falling further behind economically. Without major policy changes, many of these states could experience declining populations, reduced job opportunities, and long-term financial instability. The question remains, will red states adjust their economic policies, or will they continue to struggle with budget crises? The answer will shape the financial future of millions of Americans. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Icon Insiders for more deep dives into the figures shaping history.